So in several of these capsules, we've been exploring then the relationship between political philosophy and this genre of literature, arguably philosophy, whatever we want to call it, called graphic novels and comics. I'd like to approach this in a little bit of a different way. That is, I'd like to begin with the political philosophy without any consideration of the graphic novels that might be relevant to this passage, because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I think it's almost self-evident. And so as I read this, the best thing to do would to turn on the imagination, because I think it's evident that this particular philosophy applies to a long tradition of comics. I think that no theme, no doctrine in comics and graphic novels is any more important or any more conspicuous than the one that we're talking about now. So I'm going to read a passage from the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, wrote a number of books. He's most famous or notorious, as depending on your point of view, and he's most notorious for the phrase "God is dead," which appears in 3 of his works. Now, what he meant by that is very important, and just in a microcosm here, before we look at a couple of passages, let me try to summarize. Nietzsche believed that we had reached a point in human evolution where increasingly what we're seeing around us is what he called the last man, or last men. And women certainly should not be excluded from this consideration. What he means by last men are people who have become aimless. They are people who are wanting principles, people who are unable to manage their own affairs, people without courage, people without nobility, a lack of heroism. And he said, because that's the situation in which we find ourselves. And I think you could make a fairly good point that's true. It's pretty easy to illustrate, especially if you see the rather superficial way in which so many of us have now begun to live, and just the kind of lifestyle that we think is important, but perhaps is not important at all. So because of this conclusion, in a sense, that we have come to in human history, and in which essentially we might say we are all last men in one way or the other, Nietzsche says it's time for the emergence of what he calls the Overman. Now, depending on how you translate the German, the word is Übermensch, and so it may be translated as Superman, either Overman or Superman, and depending on the translation that you're reading, it's going to be translated one way or the other. So what is this Overman that Nietzsche says we need to recognize, we need to encourage, and in a sense we need to leave room for this individual, for these individuals to emerge and to begin to lead us, to take us beyond where we are, because we're at a point right now where, as Nietzsche says, God is dead. He means he means that in more than just a theological sense. He means that in a way in which all the philosophy, all the rationality that we have relied on up to this point is no longer useful. It's lost its meaning. It's lost its potency. Nietzsche has another book called Beyond Good and Evil. He said these boundaries of good and evil are no longer useful. So we need to move beyond good and evil. We don't need to be held back by these concepts. So Nietzsche's most important, well, it's his most accessible work, and the one that's read the most is called Thus Spake Zarathustra. It's what we would call a philosophical novel. There aren't a lot of those, or at least I think that's the best term for it. And the protagonist of this book is an individual called Zarathustra. The whole book seems to be patterned after the gospel accounts of Christ. And indeed, Nietzsche has a book called The Antichrist. And So one of the themes that he explores more in other works than this one, but nonetheless, it can certainly be discerned in Thus Spake Zarathustra, is the possibility not only of replacing Christ, but not only the possibility of doing away with Christ, but the possibility of replacing him with somebody else, with something else. Now, in fairness, Nietzsche says he isn't necessarily arguing for this. Rather, he says this is where we are at this point in time in history. I don't need to argue for it. If you just look around, if you read things I'm saying, then you will recognize that this is what we are dealing with. So, let me read a couple of passages then from Thus Spake Zarathustra. Ye higher men, learn this from me. On the marketplace no one believeth in higher men, but if you will speak there very well. The populace, however, blinketh. We are all equal. Ye higher men, so blinketh the populace. There are no higher men. We are all equal. Man is man. Before God, we are all equal. Before God. Now, however, this God has died. Before the populace, however, we will not be equal. Ye higher men, away from the marketplace. The most careful ask today, how is man to be maintained? Zarathustra, however, asketh, as the first and only one, how is man to be surpassed? The Superman I have at heart, that is the first and only thing to me, and not man, not the neighbor, not the poorest, not the sorriest, not the best. O my brethren, what I can love in man is that he is an overgoing and a downgoing. And also in you there is much that maketh me love and hope. For the great despisers are the great revelers. Now there's a lot packed into that. First we should note that this particular translator chose to put this into Elizabethan English. I imagine because of the popularity of the gospel translations in Elizabethan English. But other translations don't do that. And some people might find it less obnoxious if they do. So Nietzsche talks about the marketplace. He uses that word several times. When he uses that particular word, marketplace is a reference to where the last men gather. That is, where they spend their time. So the marketplace is a representation of that's got to be overcome, that has to be changed. It's not easy. It's not difficult, I think, at this point to infer that Nietzsche does not have a lot of sympathy for the ideas of democracy. For him, that's the worst way to go, because that's just going to try to put a losing proposition in leadership. And also this idea that we are all equal. For Nietzsche, nothing could be further than the truth. We rather need to see those who are unequal, those who, as he put it, those who overcome. And so also phrases like despising, hating. This is one way in which he is encouraging us to hate that which what we are, to despise what we are, and that will leave us more disposed to welcome something new. Okay, back to comics. I don't think it's hard to see that this is a really prominent theme that has run through almost all of the superheroes. In some ways, the whole comic industry, certainly that very big dimension of the comic industry called superheroes, is an exploration, whether it's inadvertent or not, whether the creators did this deliberately, whether they did it consciously or not. It is an exploration of what the overman might look like. And indeed, in so many of the stories, men and women, ordinary men and women, they're incapable of managing their own affairs, and so they need a superhero. I mean, what better argument might you find to substantiate what Nietzsche is arguing here? So I think this particular philosophy is a lot of fun, and the way it can be explored and the way it can be developed has endless potential.